We've been in a series called Ruth, Ashes to Beauty for the last 2 weeks. This will be the third week that we're jumping into it. We're just taking our time through the book of Ruth, understanding what's taking place in this Old Testament book. As I mentioned at the very, very beginning, there's only 2 books named after women. Ruth is one of them. And so we can see the importance here that God is trying to show us. But today, we're going to unravel a big piece of this story. The thing we've been focusing on is ashes to beauty, right? We've been talking ashes to beauty, talking through this whole entire thing of what does this actually look like, right? What does it mean to be in ashes, and how can God turn it into beauty? So last week again was our second week in it. We learned about Ruth, a Moabite woman who married into an Israelite family. In chapter 1, what we learned is this: a man named Elimelech, he moved his family from Bethlehem to Moab because there was a famine in the land. So he realized there's a famine, there's no food. So he chose to move his family out of where God told them to be, out where God wanted them to be. And he moved them into this place where God did not want them to be, in Moab, because of a famine. So there was ashes in their own life. He takes them out of it instead of running through those problems or seeing what God's going to do through it. And he took them away from it. So when they landed in Moab, again, this is a bad move. As he was running away from his problems, all he saw was ashes. He couldn't see any beauty. So while he's in Moab, this is what takes place. He dies along with both his sons. So in the first 5 verses in chapter 1, we see nothing but tragedy. We see nothing but ashes, right? As we're reading through, we're like, how can this book be this amazing, David, as you're talking about it, when in the first chapter there's literally nothing but death? So we see that death take place. We see that the first 5 verses in that chapter, everyone basically dies. That's a man in this story. So he dies along with his 2 sons. Before his 2 sons died, they married into 2 Moabite women. One of them was named Ruth. So that's how Ruth becomes a part of the family and enters into the story. Naomi is the wife or mom in this situation. She's left with her daughter-in-laws after her husband and her 2 sons die. So you can see it out of the gate, ashes, right? It's hard to see. It's like, what is taking place? What is happening? There's nothing but ashes. Then we see Naomi. What she does after this whole thing is she tries to blame God for the problem that she's facing, and she tries to hide her mistakes. They hear now that there's food back home, and she wants to go back home, but is bitter the whole entire way. I hope they get you caught up. In the midst of this, as she is saying she's going to go back from Moab, back to Bethlehem, back to her hometown because the famine has been lifted, there's food there. What she's saying is this. She's talking to her daughters-in-laws, and she says this: both of you go back to your hometown. Stay here in Moab as they're traveling. She said, stay here. I'm going to go back. Stay and go back to your mother's house and be with them. Find men again. Find love again. Find a husband again. But what we were pointing out was she's hiding her mistakes. Why would she tell these daughter-in-laws to go back to worshiping false gods, worshiping false idols? That's what they did in Moab. One of their god was a god that they sacrificed children to. So it's not something you want to be a part of, right? They were sacrificing children at the time to this god, and that was the god that they served in Moab. So she's telling go back to that. But all along, it's in her heart. What she's trying to do is hide her mistakes, because if she knows when she comes back to Bethlehem and she shows up with 2 Moabite women, they're going to start asking questions. Naomi, why did you do this? Why did you allow your sons to marry these people? But because of that, we see Orpah is one of the daughter-in-laws. She ends up going back, but Ruth stays, and she pens these words. She says these amazing words. She says this in verse 16 of chapter 1. Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. You probably have heard those words in a ceremony of marriage. But this daughter-in-law, Ruth, is speaking this to her mother-in-law. Talk about loyalty. Talk about love. Talk about grace. Talk about mercy. All of these things. She knows she's a Moabite woman. She knows she's not going to be the one that everyone wants to meet when she goes back to her hometown or to Naomi's hometown. She understands that. But instead, in the midst of her ashes, I believe she sees a glimpse of hope. She sees a glimpse of beauty, that this whole entire thing can and will turn around. And so because of her saying that, they end up going back. And we see that we're going to jump into Ruth chapter 2 in a second. But Ruth shows her loyalty. She shows her love as she tells her mother-in-law, I will stay with you forever, and goes back with her. Now today, we're going to see Ruth step into what God has for her life. Today, think about how you need to step into what God has for you. As we talk through this chapter and we get through this whole entire chapter today, that's the number one thing I want you to think about. Stepping into what God has. Because in the midst of her ashes, she's going to take a couple different steps toward what God has for her life, despite she has no idea what's going to take place. And you this morning, if you're honest, you have no idea what's going to take place tomorrow or even after church. You might know where you're going to go to lunch, but after that, you have no clue, right? We don't know, but God knows. And so all of us, we need to think about, okay, how can we step into what God has for our life, even in the midst of ashes, even when we don't know what's going to take place? How do we step into what He has for us? Because what He has for you is blessing. We're going to discuss that this week. Ruth chapter 2, open up your Bibles with me. Phone, iPad, whatever you got. And we're going to take a look at the first couple verses here in Ruth chapter 2. I'm going to read verse 22 of verse chapter 1 so we get a little bit of context moving into this. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Remember what I mentioned last week? They're coming back to town at the beginning of barley harvest. Now there's a harvest that's taking place. So there's food for them. So they're coming towards this town. Obviously they don't have anyone to take care of them, but they know that there's food there. So there's two things they need to figure out here. One, how are they going to eat? Right? We probably go week to week, day to day, hour by hour, some of us, trying to figure out what are we going to eat? How are we going to survive? It's something we think about often, right? What are we going to have for dinner? What are we going to have for lunch? What are we going to eat? Now, these two people that are coming back, they don't have anyone to take care of them. So it's the beginning of barley harvest. And in chapter 2, verse 1, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Remember, Elimelech is the father in this situation. He died with his two sons. Now it's giving you a glimpse of a relative that's nearby that they're going to meet in just a second. Verse 2. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. You might want to underline that, check that word out, favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened, quote unquote, to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, so who was a family of Elimelech. So entering into chapter 2, what we see here is this. We're going to see Ruth take a step of faith. But before we look at this, verse 1, we are introduced to a new person in the story. His name is Boaz. Can we say Boaz? Boaz. One more time. Boaz. Perfect. Boaz is a new person in this story. We need to know who he is as it sets up this next part of the story. So who is Boaz? Boaz was a relative of Naomi's husband, a part of Elimelech's family. This is very important information, so make sure you note it, highlight it, whatever you need to know. It's for later. We're going to learn about this a little bit later in chapter 3. Part 2 of that. He was very wealthy. So it says right out of the gate, he has great wealth. Right? So he's a part of their family somehow, distant relative, cousin, whatever that looks like. He was a part of Elimelech's family, and he was very wealthy. If you look at the NIV, it states this: he is a man of standing. So that would mean character, right? He has integrity. He's a man of character. He's a leader. He owned his own land, had his own harvest, had his own field. So this tells us what kind of wealth he had. But let me give you a little reminder here. Where this is taking place? This is during the time of Judges still. So even though the famine was just lifted, or there's still chaos in the land because it's in the midst of Judges, so there's no ruler at the time, Boaz was a wealthy man and a man of character. So even in the midst of chaos, even in the midst of the book of Judges, right, where these people are being judged, you have a man of character who's doing the right thing. Now that points something very key, because so many times in our life, we're in the midst of people that we know don't have integrity or don't have the best character, but who are you going to be? Who are you going to be? Even when everyone else is doing something you know they shouldn't be doing and they want you to do it, who are you going to be? Are you going to be a man of standing or a woman of standing, or are you going to be just like them? Because Boaz could have been just like the rest of the people. He could have been just like them, doing what they were doing. Not looking at any rules or commandments or listening to God at all. But instead, he was a man of standing in the midst of judgment. And so now that we understand who Boaz is, what we see in verse 2 is Ruth steps in faith despite her ashes. So if you're taking notes with me, the title this morning is Step into What God Has, and the first point is Step in Faith. Step in faith. We see Ruth step in faith despite her ashes. How many of us need to do this morning? How many of us need the strength to step into faith despite our ashes? Because a lot of times, as we've been talking about this, right, the ashes that are in our life, sometimes it literally stops us in our tracks and we don't want to move forward because we can't see what's ahead of us. So because we can't see what's ahead of us, it's so hard to take a step of faith. But isn't that faith? When you take a step and you don't know what's on the other side? And so we need to make sure we take those steps of faith. But Ruth steps out in faith despite her ashes. She steps out. She doesn't blame God for her situation and sit idle. She moves. This is what's so interesting about her character that we see. One, we see she's loyal, right, church? We see how loyal she is to her mother-in-law. But two, we see here her faith that she has. As she represented and told Naomi, look, I will serve your God. I will serve your God. He will become my God. And she has a life change that takes place. So now she's not only saying, look, I'm here for you, but now she's going to take a step of faith into the next move that God has for her life. But she doesn't turn around and blame God for her situation or blame God for the ashes. And so many times we're stuck blaming God for the ashes that we don't move to what's next in our life. And this morning, some of us need to do that. You don't need to keep looking back at your past and keep looking back at your past and keep looking back at your past. He has a future ahead for you. Amen. Do not let the enemy lie to you this morning and tell you he doesn't. He does. And this morning you may not know what it looks like. I can't tell you what it looks like, but he can. As Clay was mentioning during worship, he's above time and space. He sees the whole entire thing front to end. And that's the God that you serve, someone who knows, someone who gets it, someone who came down to earth as a human, a baby. So guess what? We can relate and understand. That's an amazing God that we serve. So we see here that she takes that step of faith, and so many times ashes can overwhelm us that we begin to become stagnant, and that fear starts to settle in. Has anyone haven't made a move because of fear in your life, that you're so fearful of what's next, so you don't take that step? I was talking to someone recently. I had something happen a couple weeks ago just in my own personal life, and it was a struggle. It was something, just kind of a mind-blowing experience of different things. You're just like, okay, Lord, what does this mean? You know, what's taking place? And I got on the phone with another pastor of mine and just kind of telling him what I was going through. And he said this, he said, David, listen, the enemy wants nothing more than to instill fear into your heart. Because the minute that you're fearful is the minute you stop moving. The minute you're fearful is the minute you stop doing what God's called you to do. Don't let the enemy instill fear into your life. When God's people are fearful, nothing takes place because we're so scared. We start taking steps back. We don't want to move forward. We're scared of what people are going to think. We're scared of our past coming back. We're scared of those past mistakes, right? And that causes fear in our life. And so we don't move. So he kept telling me, David, do not let fear be instilled into your life. God has something big. Keep going. Keep going. Push through. Ask him for the strength that you need to keep moving. So for you, Christian, this morning, maybe you're stuck in fear. I'm going to encourage you, keep moving. I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. I know at times you don't want to. Trust in God. He has you. Trust in him and keep moving. The gospel isn't going to keep pushing forward unless we're the ones pushing it. Right, church? We need to be the ones behind it, pushing it forward. You want to see a radical change in our nation and in our valley? Push the gospel forward. You want to see change in people's hearts? Love on them as Jesus loved them. Love on them like Jesus has. That's how we're going to change things. It's not by posting it on Facebook. It's by being one-on-one with people, loving them and building relationship with them. I know the digital time we live in, I get it. It can be used for God's glory. But sometimes we need to be face-to-face with people, loving on them, caring for them in that way. We're going to see a man who Boaz is. We're going to see what God does through this man in just a second. But you're going to see how in his life, how he cares for people. But this is what she does. She moves, and this is what she asks for. She asks for favor. So many times in our own life, we don't want to pray those types of things. I don't know if anyone's been there, where you don't want to pray for yourself. You feel weird. You're like, I don't want to pray for favor. That's weird, right? I don't want to ask God to bless me. I feel strange doing that. It's like, Lord, bless me. And I got to ask the question, why? Why do you feel like it's so hard to ask for those blessings? Why do you feel like it's hard to ask for favor? You want a new job, right? And you go in for an interview. You should be praying, Lord, give me favor in this interview. Give me favor in this time of my life. Give me favor in X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. It's okay to pray those things. And Naomi's asking, she's saying this, I'm going to go glean heads in the field, and hopefully I will find someone that I may find favor in. So she can do that. I'll give you a little backstory in just a second. So what she's saying is favor. She's saying, who will be gracious enough to let me glean? So what is gleaning, and what is she talking about? In God's commandment, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, stepping back a little bit into the Old Testament, God gave a commandment to the people. He said this commandment was talking about loving your neighbor as yourself. So God speaks and he says, look, everyone that's listening, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. So we talk about the two main commandments, right? You see it all over our logos, is love God and love people. If we say we love God, then we definitely love people. And I know at times there's really hard people to love. Anyone with me? Really hard. But God calls us to do it. Yeah. And we can. So God, he said, look, this is a commandment. I want you to love your neighbor as yourself. How? He says, when they would reap a harvest. So that means when the fields would start reaping a harvest. God said to consider the poor by leaving gleanings for them. This is the act of collecting leftover crops from the farmers. So as they would go in and collect the harvest, as they would go in and do their job, they would leave certain parts of the field so the poor, the needy, can come and glean the fields after they're done. Talk about taking care of your neighbor, right? God commanded this. So what Ruth is talking about here is just this. She's saying, hopefully I find favor with somebody so I can glean the fields and pick up barley, wheat, whatever it is, and take it back to my home so I can eat. So that's what Ruth is speaking about here. She's asking, Lord, she's saying to Naomi, hopefully I find favor with somebody. In 2 Corinthians 9:8 it says this, and God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. How many of us love to share? I got 3 hands. My kids always do this all the time. It's funny because when they want someone else to share, they say that sharing is caring. And then when they don't want to share, it's not even a part of their brain. Yes? Anyone with kids? Right? It's like, you need to share, you need to share, you need to share, but this is mine. It's mine. Right? It's mine. But you need to share that thing. And it's so interesting how at the very beginning what we teach our children is share. But I love how that changes over time as you get older. You try to instill this thing into their life, say share. You need to share those things, right? And then later on in life, it's like, I love this. When people have trucks, and you know you have that friend that has that truck, and that person that has their truck wishes they didn't have a truck. Because when moving days come, right? That old thing that your mom used to say, sharing is caring, comes back. And you have that friend that calls you, hey, I do this to my father all the time. Hey, Tim, can I borrow your truck? All the time. I need to take something to the dump or whatever it is. And then sharing is caring, right? It happens. So we know that, right? We understand that. But what this is saying in 2 Corinthians is absolutely true. It says, God will generously provide all that you need. Do you see that word? Generously. God's a generous God. So in turn, don't you think we should be generous people? He says this, God will provide generously. Then you will always have everything you need. So if we have everything we need and plenty left over, what should we do with the plenty left over? We should share it. We should help someone else out. We should give to the needy. We should give to the poor. And so this is the whole point of what she's talking about. She's like, I want to go into the fields. But this is it. When we step into what God has for us, we start to see the blessings. We start to actually see blessings when we step into what God has for us. And let me explain this really quick. Blessings isn't a bad word. And let me give you a reason why. I believe in this culture we say, you'll be blessed. That all of a sudden we have this mindset that means financially, or talking about finances. If you give to the church, you'll be blessed. Anyone ever heard that? So we have this negative connotation about this word, but it's not a bad word. Blessing comes in all shapes and sizes. Yes, can blessings be financial? Absolutely. It absolutely can. But it's also in relationships, it's also in your jobs, it's also in your cars, it's also in your kids, it's also all over your life. Blessings come in all shapes and sizes. And so God does want to bless you in many ways. So she steps out, and again, quote, and happens to be in the field belonging to Boaz. This word happens, it's like us saying it's luck, right? That there's chance involved when we know there's not. God's hand is in this whole entire situation. Nothing is by accident, it's all by appointment. And God is showing up. God's not even really mentioned at all here. But the point is that in the midst of your ashes, in the midst of your problems, in the midst of your difficulty, God is the one guiding the whole entire thing. And so He's working on your behalf, even if it's in the background. Because again, we can't see it all, but He does. So we see Him moving through this story, moving through Ruth. She doesn't just happen to be there in Boaz's field. God ordained it, and He said it by appointment. So don't be afraid to step through the ashes, because blessings will come, and guess what? Grace awaits. Grace awaits. And I know it's difficult at times to walk through those things, right? But there is blessing that will come, and there is grace that awaits. So Ruth, number one, she steps in faith. This is big, because she moves. She doesn't sit idle, and she doesn't blame God for her problems. She takes the first step. She says, I'm not going to sit here with my mother-in-law. I love her, but we have to eat. We have to keep doing something. So she moves. She steps in faith. And number two, she steps into grace. Read with me in verse 4 as we continue on. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Look at the respect his people have for him. Verse 5, then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Now let's read through that text really quick. Whose young woman is this? Now in that time frame, he's probably saying it very, very, nice. He's Boaz. I don't know what he looks like, but he's like, oh, whose young woman is this? It's probably how I think he sounds. But really, this is what he's saying. Wow. That girl over there is beautiful. What's her name? Where's she from? Whose woman is this? That's the connotation here. That's what's being spoken. He's saying, whose young woman? Look how he asks, whose young woman is this? Is she married? Does she have a boyfriend? What's going on here? That's what Boaz is saying here. So let's make sure we understand it. This is that love at first sight type of feeling, right? Whose young woman is this? So in verse 6. So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, is the young Moabite woman, listen what he says here, Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. So key parts there. Highlight them, write them down. We're going to come back to this. And she said to him, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little bit in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor? Look at that word again. Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? The guy he just spoke to called it out. He said, she's a Moabite woman from Moab. That didn't stop Boaz. She says, why do you take favor on me, since I'm a foreigner? Verse 11, and Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to the people whom you did not know before. So he calls out, he says, look, I heard about what you did. This is amazing. Verse 12, and the Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I love that he says this. Then she said, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord. For you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. So she understands at the very end here of this conversation that she's different. She knows she's from Moab. She knows she's a foreigner. She knows that probably many people don't like her because of their past as a people. But she steps into grace and receives it. And so many times in our life, we don't step into grace and we don't receive it. That's hard for us at times. We need to do the same thing that she's doing. Step into that grace. And don't be afraid to receive the grace. God gives it to you. But because of fear or past things in our life, we don't step into grace because we're stuck in fear. So Ruth, clearly she steps into the grace and receives it. The grace that we're talking about was Boaz in this situation. The servant points out something. Again, he brings up that she's a Moabite, a foreigner, which, by the way, again, they were very disliked people in Israel. Despite her being that, he goes to her and starts a conversation. Look at verse 8 again. So this guy tells him, look, this is her, this is what took place. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So immediately after he hears about the situation, I don't know where he is, if he's really far away from the field, if he's close, whatever it is, but I can clearly see it's that situation in a movie where it's like, dun, 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 as he's running towards Ruth. Anyone with me? I'm trying to give you a picture here of this glorious, beautiful story. As Boaz, again, as he sees Ruth, he runs after her, and he's so gracious to her. He takes the foreigner and he brings her into his family. This is what he's talking about. What an amazing man that we see as he shows up and says this, look, will you listen? Do not glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close to my young women. He's saying, stay here, I got you. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. I've commanded the young men not to touch you. And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Look at his heart right now. Gracious, loving, caring for the poor, caring for the needy. He knows she's a foreigner, yet he steps into it and he starts a conversation. And in verse 10 we read, so she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? She doesn't understand it, but remember this key thing. Do you remember the seed that she planted before? She planted a seed of loyalty. Of loyalty. We've been talking about this idea of seed planting over the last couple of weeks, that we'll reap what we sow, right? So whatever seed that we plant, it's going to grow. So you plant a seed of negativity, guess what's going to grow? A tree of negativity and those fruits. And so for her, what did she do? She planted a seed of loyalty. When she said to her mother-in-law, I'm here for you, I will die. That's what's going to separate us, is death. She planted that seed, and now what's starting to grow is that plant. And now people can start to see the fruit of it. The fruit of it. So because of that seed she planted, here's what happens. Boaz responds. She says, why would you do this to a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, he saw the seed, he heard about it, now he sees the plants and the fruits that's growing from it. He says in verse 11, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. He heard about the seed. He sees the plant now. He's starting to see the fruit. We reap what we sow. And so what she did, she planted that seed of loyalty, and now she's being blessed for it. That seed is now starting to sprout. He can see the fruit, and people can see that. Boaz heard about it, heard about what he's done, and now he's blessing her for it. And then he again will continue to show her grace. But it's amazing to see this because she's stepping into it. She's stepping into it. We see a beautiful picture here of grace, of a foreigner who doesn't deserve this. Doesn't deserve this. And yet Boaz gives it. In verse 14, it continues on. It says this, now Boaz said to her at mealtime, this is like a first date here, come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate, and she was satisfied and kept some back. This is leftovers. She ate everything, she was satisfied, and now she has some extras. And in verse 15, and when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also, let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. So now, guess what? More blessings to come. He's saying when she's out there, let even more fall to the ground so she can pick it up. Let's bless her. So he has all of these guys. He knows what's taking place. They can see how he's responding to her, and that there's something going on. But he says again, he shows grace, allows her to sit at the table. Let me remind you, she's a foreigner. Let me remind you, she's a Moabite woman. And Boaz, this man of standing, he allows her to come sit at his table, and he feeds her. There's something so big in this whole entire story that we need to look at. We are called to take care of the needy. We are called to take care of the poor. We are called to take care of our brothers and sisters who absolutely need it. When we talk about generosity in the Bible, this is it. It's being generous to those that need it. And Boaz is clearly doing this. I'm sure this is not the first time he's ever helped somebody. Look at the respect the people have for him. When he came and said, Lord bless you, they said, Lord bless you. Why? Because I believe every single servant that worked for Boaz was so blessed by this man that God allowed him to be financially wealthy. God allowed him to own his own crops and own his own field so he can bless others with a job, so he can bless others with food, so he can give generously to those that need it. There's so many times I feel like we forget about this as a church. That the church is a hospital. The church is for those that need help. But we get caught up again in our buildings and these types of things and all of our programs that we have. You got to go to this, you got to go to that. That we forget one simple thing. Jesus calls us to love Him and love people. So if we're loving people the right way, we're going to have a heart like Boaz that gives generously. And maybe you say, but I don't have that much. I don't make that much. I don't have what Boaz has. But everything you have was given to you. Do you think that you deserved it? But God, in all of His grace, gave it to you. And in return, we should use those things that God has given us to bless others. Have a heart of generosity. If more people were generous in this day and age, we'd have a radical change in our country. We'd have a radical change in our world. And so Boaz here, we see his heart in this. As again, he's blessing this foreigner. and he sees her story, understands what's taking place, but he has a heart of generosity. He's showing grace. He's letting her sit at the table and eat until she's full. Jesus has allowed you to sit at his table and eat until you're satisfied. And this is that picture of Boaz, as he is a picture of Jesus, what we'll get into in a second. But he lets her eat. Then he tells his men, let grain fall purposely so she can pick it up. Boaz is showing his generous heart, but now there is hope. Hear me, church. Now there's hope. We come out of ashes in this situation, and she steps in faith right into grace, and now she's going to step into hope. Because that's what God does. In the midst of our ashes, we don't see it all. We don't see any of it. But there is hope. There is hope. And so we see in the rest of this chapter, continue reading with me in verse 17, it says this, so she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned. And it was an ephah of barley. Let me give you another definition of that, a bushel. And for this, looking at and understanding what that is, it's maybe roughly about 30 to 60 pounds. 30 to 60 pounds. Think about that for 1 second. In this time frame, scholars believe that the payout for a day would maybe be 2 to 3 pounds. And guess what Ruth walks away with? Anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds that she's able to take home. Talk about grace. Talk about love. Talk about taking care of the foreigner and the needy. But Boaz allows this. Then she took it up and went into the city. And her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back. So this is what she does. She gives, or their mother-in-law sees all of this that she brings home. And then additionally, she brings out what she kept back. Remember the leftovers she had at the Boaz grill? Yeah. She brought that food out and she gave it to her mother-in-law. She kept back. She had been satisfied. She brought that out and handed it to her in verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. Remember Naomi's heart? Remember her name now? What is it? Mara. She changed her name to bitterness. But look at what she's saying from her own mouth. Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, this man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Here's the thing. She has no clue what we read in verse 1 of chapter 2. She doesn't know that Boaz is a part of the family. That's us seeing into the future of the story. She has no clue that Boaz is a part of the family. She has no clue who this man is. And so she says, I was able to glean in the fields of Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relation to ours, one of our close relatives. So she now tells her, he's a part of our family. Ruth and the Moabitess said this. He also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman, and that people do not meet you in any other field. So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So she stayed there from anywhere from 2 to 4 months, as every single day she went, and she was able to glean in the field, take home what she needed every single day, week in and week out. But again, one thing they didn't know that they would have was food. This wasn't a sure thing when they came back to Bethlehem. She comes back with an overabundance, and now she knows that there actually could be hope in her situation. Remember, they didn't know what they were walking into when they came back. They don't know who's going to take care of them. And she happens to meet Boaz, happens to be in his field. She now sees hope for her and Naomi to have food and family. The things that they lost before, they now are gaining back again. There's hope here. And Naomi again turns from being bitter to saying blessed. Naomi, or Mara, also sees the hope that's found in Boaz in this situation, that he can help them. So that bitterness now can be turned into blessings. Just like that. There may be times of bitterness. There may be times of anger. have to rely on the Lord and realize that there's hope found in Jesus, so we can turn that bitterness into blessing. So we can understand that those ashes can be turned into beauty. They can be. But it's only because of faith, it's only because of grace, and it's only because of hope found in Jesus that can happen. Boaz is a man, but he's also a picture of who is to come, and that is Jesus. We clearly see it. Here's a couple things that Boaz did. Boaz took initiative. In verse 8, we see him go to Ruth. We see him go to Ruth. Let me tell you this. Grace means that God makes the first move, and he did it on the cross. He made the first move. He came down to this earth, and he died for our sins. He came to our aid when we did not deserve it at all. Why? Because he loves us. That's why. In 1 John 4:19, it says this, we love each other because he loved us first. He loved us first. So he made the first move by coming down, dying for our sins, and saying, look, now you can enter into the kingdom with me by believing upon me. But it's by his grace that we are saved through faith. And so he makes that very clear. He goes to Ruth, and Boaz takes the initiative just like Jesus. Boaz then speaks to Ruth. He interrupts his conversation with the guy he was speaking to and went to the poor stranger in the field who was a foreigner. Just like Jesus does with us. As the outcasts, as the ones that don't have family, what does he do? He starts the conversation with us. He says, look, I came to you. I came to you, the foreigner, the outcast, the forgotten, and I died for you. And all I want is a relationship with you now. In Luke 15:4 it says this, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go search for the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. What is he talking about? He's going after the one that's lost. He will leave the 99 behind to find it. That's how much Jesus cares for you. You might feel lost this morning. You might feel separation between you and God. He is running over those mountains like we proclaim in worship. He's tearing down walls. He's shining light. He's going into the darkness. He's trying to find you because he cares for you. And just like Boaz, we see, he goes to the foreigner and he starts to have that conversation. Boaz also promised to protect her and provide for her needs. He told her, stay here, glean. Also told his men to let her take whatever she wants whenever she needs it. She can have it. Jesus will protect us and he will provide for us. We take refuge underneath his wings. Remember when Boaz stated this? It's amazing that we see this in the book of Ruth because we see it later on in Proverbs and in Psalms. That he says the same thing. He says, look, you came here in verse 14, now Boaz in mealtime, when he says this, he says, come sit at the table, right? What he's saying is, I'm taking care of you. I will provide for your needs. Everything that you need, it's here. And just like Jesus, he says the same thing to us in Psalm 91:44. It says this, he will cover you with his feathers. He will shelter you with his wings. His faithful promises are your armor and your protection. How many of you just need to stop looking at your past and start looking to the future promises that God has for you? That's what needs to take place. Stop relying on the past and the past mistakes and all those problems and the fear. Move into the promises that God has for you. Just like she's doing right now. And what Boaz is saying to her is, look, I promise to protect you. I promise to provide for your needs. And just like that, Jesus did the same thing to us. He is our armor. He is our protector. He will provide everything. And he says, come underneath my wings. I will be your shelter. So maybe this morning, this is where you're at. You feel like you have no protection. You feel like you're covered in fear. You feel like you can't move forward. But let me show you what Ruth does. Despite her ashes, Ruth forgot about her fears and focused on the promises. She focused on the promises of God. She focuses on the promises that were laid out before her. Jesus is all of this to us. This is a clear picture of who Jesus is and how he loves us dearly. This morning, we need to stop focusing on the fears and start looking forward to the promises this morning. God has promises for your life. He wants those things to take place. He has something in the midst of ashes. He promised he will provide. He promised he will take care of you. He promised he will love you. No one likes ashes, but we need them in order to see the beauty. We need them. So this morning, I hope you see that in chapter 2, that those ashes that were taking place are now being turned into beauty. And just like Ruth's story, it's the same for you. This can happen. And right now, I know, in the midst of the ashes, it's hard to see. But stop looking at the ashes. Start looking at the promises of God and move forward. Because He has amazing things in store in your life. It's coming. Keep running. Ask Him for the strength when you need it. And continue to give glory and praise to God despite what's taking place in your life. He's your protector. And He will provide every single thing you need. Do you hear me, church, this morning? He will provide every single thing that you need. Can we stand?